Welcome to the Edge You Magic New Educator podcast, the go-to show for supporting new educators navigating the exciting journey from campus to the classroom. Join your host, Dr. Sam Fecich, for a blend of inspiration, advice, and practical strategies, one cup of coffee at a time.
I'm Christy Hemingway, host of Ed Curation, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hello, EduMagicians, and welcome back to another episode of the Edu Magic Podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Fecich, and today I have with me Colleen Evens, and she's going to be sharing about restorative justice. And I think this is such an important topic for our pre-service and student teachers to listen in on and how to implement into their classroom. Dr. Evens, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am truly honored to just jump in and have this dialogue with you this morning.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm excited to have you on. Could you share a little bit for our listeners, a little bit about yourself and what brought you into education?
Yeah, sure. I think it's always important to know the why. And it's interesting when we kind of talk to educators, they kind of fall into two categories. Those who had an incredible education experience and want to continue that, or those who did not and they want to inspire and make a change. I feel like my story goes back and it was a little bit of both. I'll start a little bit with my own education experience, which kind of lends into my why. I started in a Catholic school and it was very different, that experience back then. We didn't really talk about feelings and emotions. It was really centered on just academics. I think that kind of lends into my why. I played the cello at a very young age. I actually began as a music educator, and I taught in a elementary school, grades kindergarten through fifth grade, for 15 years. And I love that because I was able to really combine like the heart and the head of the work. And kids lend themselves to the arts and to music as an expression. But I really was seeking some leadership opportunities in the building, like joining different committees. And it was actually my principal who kind of tapped me on the shoulder, as many good leaders do, to say, hey, have you ever thought about maybe this? I became an assistant to the principal and kind of got to really delve into the logistics of the building with scheduling and facilitating supervisions like at lunch and bus. That led me to become a dean of students. And I think throughout this whole process, I've always really been focused on the reflective nature of teaching and learning, both at the adults, because the adults who are in front of the students are going to make the biggest impact. Then I sought out my doctorate in educational leadership and equity through the University of Southern California, and have really spent the majority of the last 3 years working really hard on my campus with restorative justice practices and implementing those, and also sustaining that and growing it, not just with the teachers, but with the students and families and the community.
Oh, that is a great story. Going from the heart and the mind, which it sounds like you're still doing, and that seems to be a theme throughout your educational journey. And it just seems like it just keeps growing and expanding. And we're now into restorative practices. Let's go ahead and just start with some definitions and terms for our listeners today. How would we define restorative practices in our conversation?
Sure. I think I almost have to back it up with all humans are truly hardwired to connect. Just as we need like food, shelter, clothing, human beings also really need strong and meaningful relationships to thrive. When we think about restorative practices, it really is a field that's within the social sciences that studies how to strengthen those relationships between individuals, as well as the social connections within communities. It really is a movement of shifting the focus from blame and punishment more to repairing the harm and building on relationships and communities.
If you think about that definition of restorative practice, how does that relate back to your teaching experience and your experience as a leader?
That's a great question. I think that goes back to like the heart and the head is that you have to have the will and the skill to do this work. And I think that starts with the adults looking within. It's kind of like that mirror work
Mm.
of how am I going to shift from being the victim to how am I going to hear other perspectives? And as educators, we want to always teach our students and our families different strategies to hear those perspectives. And that's often done through storytelling. As a music educator, we would do it through music and different modalities of learning, whether it was like kinesthetic or oral or visual. You're kind of taking that same approach and you're humanizing the experience through conversations and storytelling in lots of different ways.
Absolutely. We can define restorative practices, but we know that there are four main parts of restorative practice. Would you mind sharing about what they are and explaining them a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Before there was restorative communities would really embrace the three R's, which was relationship, respect, and responsibility. But more recently, restorative justice practices has also added to the relationship, respect, and responsibility, repair and reintegration.
Ooh.
And I think that's an important topic is once we repair, how do we reintegrate students and adults and the community to really have that sense of belonging? But coming from the actual restorative justice in action and Ted Watchell, which is the International Institute for Restorative Practices, those four pillars are respect, healing, empathy, and accountability. We're always moving in that like circular approach of
Mhm.
which one are we talking about in this conversation and which one are we working and driving toward?
Mhm. Where would you say future teachers need to start with when it comes to restorative practice? Like, how do they get started using these pillars in their own practices?
Mhm. I think you have to start with like the absolute basics. And that starts, like I said, with the adults who are in front of the student. We have to engage in the work first. And I think that starts with actually feeling what the experience is like. I suggest in a school community, like close the computers and sit in a circle with just the adults, with your staff, with your teachers, whether it's in a staff meeting or maybe an institute day or a professional learning community, is the circles do not always have to start when harm occurs, but rather it really builds that community through storytelling, starting with a story or a prompt of explain to me your childhood education experience and actually sitting and circling and talking about that. And then making those connections to, okay, but what is your why as an educator? And having that open dialogue, if the adults start to experience it first, then they can actually teach it and model it. And it
Mm.
really becomes that whole community kind of like intervention and we're pushing forward. I
Mhm.
also think that you can really start with the basics of just the restorative question. Something I know I've done on my campus is like on our lanyards, just have those questions printed with like a quick go-to. And those questions just center on when harm occurs or conflict occurs between students, you always start with asking, what happened? And you're removing any assumptions or bias by just asking them to explain through their experience and through their perspective. And then you want to follow up with what were you thinking and or feeling at that time?
Mhm.
Followed up with what are you thinking and are feeling now? Because those emotions, they change. And we want to give students the language to name that thought and that emotion, because that's kind of the first step is where do I fall in this? How is this making me feel? And then this is where we kind of move into that restorative piece is who was affected by what happened and how were they affected? And then lastly, what do you need to do to make it right? And what will you do in the future to prevent this from happening again? And engaging those conversations among two students, it opens up the conversation. Um, It's pretty incredible what students and even adults will say to one another and the healing that occurs right in front of you.
Wow, that sounds really, really powerful for students, for teachers. And I can hear in the questions, there's no blame, there's no shame for the feelings that the students are feeling. And it kind of is reminding me a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, zone of regulation. There's zones of regulation. Does that play a role at all in restorative justice practices?
Yeah, I think that there is this misconception when we're talking of restorative justice, like it is a one-stop shop type of thing. And it's not. It actually has to be interwoven with social emotional learning, which is the zones of regulation. Like you're
Mm,
naming the emotion. It also falls into what most schools have as like a positive
mhm,
intervention or school-wide positive
mhm.
intervention. You're like PBIS. We love our
Yeah,
acronyms
I
in
know, right?
education. I think all of those things fall together. And the misconception is that we only use restorative practices when something awful has happened. And
Mm.
that's actually not the case. We want our students to start naming what they're thinking, how they're feeling, and really work more on the preventative end. And when we're building these deep, meaningful relationships, when harm occurs, it's a lot easier to repair it.
Yes, because they've had that practice. They've had the practice through the questions. They've had the practice through identifying their emotions and being okay with having those emotions for some time, and then realizing, you know what, my emotions might change from the time that that event happened to now. And I love how you shared, like, it really, this restorative justice isn't a standalone practice. It
Mhm.
is something that's interwoven throughout the school and the community within that school, that community of learning. When we're thinking about these restorative justice practices, where often do you see these occurring every day in classrooms? Are you thinking more of like a morning meeting, kind of like a, or like during study hall for our older students? Where does this usually occur?
I, uh, I think that's really important to kind of name it and be specific. I think it's like twofold. You actually have to do the structure and the setting up. When we sit in circle as a large group, as a community with students, that has to be done in every single setting of the building because what a PE or physical education classroom looks like is very different than maybe a math classroom.
Yes.
And that's just the nature of the setting, right? Like the gym is larger, it echoes, there might be more students involved. We have to do it in multiple ways and in multiple settings, but we actually have to teach it first. We have to teach what it feels like to sit in a circle. We use a talking piece, which comes from the indigenous practices of that we are truly listening to one another and not listening to respond, but rather listening to understand. And that's kind of like that number three, that empathy pillar. We have to be strategic also with the norms. These are the norms. When we sit in circle, we use I statements. We speak from the heart. We don't laugh at others, we laugh with others. It is this like indigenous idea of we are together, we are a community. That has to be taught. But then I also think that it also has to happen organically throughout the day as situations arise. It doesn't necessarily mean like students are going to go down to the office and it's going to be this formal restorative conference. It could just be I'm going to have these two students talk in the hallway and we're going to go through those questions and we might find a resolution very quickly.
Mhm.
Sometimes you need more of that other set, like tier two or tier three, where you are going to the office, you're removing the students from a setting or from triggers, and you have to do the pre-conference first to really make sure that the conversation is meaningful. I think it's kind of that twofold. The actual teaching has to be done, but it also has to be done continuously throughout the day. And that's like the buy-in is so important that
Mhm.
everyone in the community is on board to do this, to ask these questions and to participate.
I'm hearing you say it's something that needs to be embedded throughout that school mindset and teaching on how to conduct these practices with that are meaningful and purposeful for our students and for the staff. When I picture this, I'm picturing, okay, this is gonna, I can see this in like a, for example, a third grade class, a fifth grade class, where the teacher sees the students all the time? What about teachers who teach, we call them specials here in Pennsylvania, but like computer, art, gym, like those types of things, where they only see students maybe once a week? How is that practice? I know the setup and the teaching of it isn't different, but do you see that different situations may arise depending on where the students are in their week or during the day?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and that's often what becomes a barrier is time or scheduling those special area teachers or the expos where they might not see them as often or every day or for not as long. You don't have that big chunk of time. But it's really important that it's embedded still within your curriculum. It could just lend itself to, we're going to name what our objective is today, and then we're going to sit in maybe smaller circles like campfire groups, where it's groups of 3 or 4 students, and we're going to open up with maybe a background experience about what we're learning today. Like as a music teacher, we would do this often, is we would kind of have our objective for the day of students will be learning this concept. And I would start with them just circling up and talking about something maybe they've experienced in the past, or maybe something they haven't. We're engaging in a very different way. And that's where it lends itself more that like social emotional learning, as well as you're allowing the students to take ownership of their learning. And you're really teaching that listening piece. I think that's really important, and that we're being strategic in everything that we're doing in the classroom. Is we're naming every single expectation of, this is what we're going to learn. This is how we're going to move. This is the way we're going to learn it. We're doing it in those different modalities, and we're hearing from others. And I think it lends itself really nicely, like even in, I mentioned a PE class or an art class, to circle up and talk about or share your artwork and talk about why you drew that. What were the materials you used? Was it paint? Was it colored pencils? And listening to one another or asking questions. Again, it goes back to that community building.
Yes. And as evident throughout our conversation today, that community building. Dr. Evens, I think the listeners are going to have to go back and rewind, because there's been so many strategies shared in this episode. Where can they get in touch and learn more about restorative practices?
Yeah, sure. There are so many great resources that are available. There's so many great books. You can contact me directly. I'm always willing to, if you have questions, you can reach out. Recently, my dissertation is being published. It's in that works.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But it's on analyzing middle school teachers' perceptions on non-exclusionary discipline practices. Restorative justice practices falls into that. Through a series of interviews, really get to learn about teachers' perceptions on how these practices are implemented and how they are sustained, or what are the barriers causing them to be sustained. You can really work through that in your own campus.
Nice. That sounds awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's going to get published. Congratulations too, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Evens, thank you for your time today. This has been a fantastic conversation. Not only was it informative, but it was actionable, with ways to get started in restorative justice practices and the why behind it, why it's important to start implementing this in the classroom and as a school-wide support. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the EduMagic New Educator podcast. If you found it helpful, please leave a rating and review or share it with a friend. Always remember, you have the EduMagic in you.